You must remember this. A kiss
This
is
is the Karl
blackest.
Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show. I'm Karl Gerber, and this show has absolutely nothing to do with employment law today. I should tell you that the last month I've done just about nothing other than research a particular point in film and San Fernando Valley history. For those of you who don't know, besides being a lawyer, what I do at night is I study history. And this is one of those stories where, well, it was always in my face, and I never knew it, and that really bothered me. Once I found out that right across from where I grew up and the junior high school that I went to was the home of Hal B. Wallis, arguably, although I don't think arguably, the most prolific film producer in Hollywood history. We're going to talk about Hal Wallis, the film industry, and of course, the site that his home was on that is now Millikan Junior High School. You will see all sorts of images. Some of these have never been shown before. So please enjoy this. Understand this took a considerable amount of time. I'm not a film historian, but we're going to be talking about film, and I have a certain amount of knowledge of film, and I think we've got this down right, so we're going to start. Born in 1898 in a West Side Chicago tenement to Jewish parents whose people were vaguely displaced between Poland, which is modern-day Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Russia, by immigration, Aaron Blum Waleniski produced two Academy Award-winning movies, 386 to 498 other films, and worked with the majority of A-list golden and silver screen talent, ultimately evolving into Hal Brent Wallis, the man whose education ended at age 14, died in 1986. Wallace's sister, Mina, was 2 years older than him, and she preceded him in relocating to Hollywood. She worked for Warner's lawyer, Edward Loeb of Loeb, Walker, and Loeb. Us attorneys know today that firm is Loeb and Loeb, which is one of the big firms. When Jack Warner was looking for a secretary, Edward Loeb suggested Mina, and she became Jack Warner's secretary. Soon, she undertook the role of agent. By 1930, she was representing Clark Gable. She suggested her brother for a job, and now we're going back to the 20s, a job managing the Garrick Theater Cinema, and I apologize, we're not in the 20s, we're pre-1920. This was a silent house at 8th and Broadway in downtown Los Angeles. Wallace quit his job as a traveling salesman and moved to Los Angeles. Soon Mina introduced him to Jack Warner. At the time, Warner Brothers was on Sunset and Bronson. Less than 20 years old, so we must be in 1918, Wallace became Warner's assistant publicity director. So at 20, he was the publicity director for the then existing incarnation of Warner Studios. In order to improve their mother's tuberculosis, Mrs. Waleniski moved to California. She was a marvelous cook. She briefly operated a restaurant on Hollywood Boulevard where Wallace claims the restaurant failed because his mother took too many bad checks, presumably from actors, with notations that the actors coming in were Charlie Chaplin, Valentino, and other regulars. Wallace's publicity role at Warner included, on April 26, 1925, sending off the first piece of Hollywood publicity on a Vitagraph, which is a recordable device, kind of like a record. The message began, Warners will enter policy for talking pictures. Of equal importance to the rest of his life, his publicity role brought him into contact with a bad personality German shepherd named Rin Tin Tin, whose $1,000 a week salary was the highest actor's salary at Warner at the time. Wallis's most important job was rolling out red carpets for the canine when his train rolled into town and arranging publicity shots of the animal disembarking. Louise Fendeza. She was the only human Wallis had seen get on the good side of Rin Tin Tin when she starred in Lighthouse by Sea, a silent film in 1925, scripted by Darryl Zanuck. Impressed with Louise's animal skills, Wallis asked her on a date in his Model T Ford. She was a famous silent comedic star at the time who drove a 12-cylinder Cadillac. Neither of them had before met a member of the opposite sex like the other. Thanksgiving Day 1927, with Jack Warner the best man, the two married at 5402 9th Street in Los Angeles. Wallis thought Louise's home was far better than where he was living. He later described the home as an elegant duplex. 200 people attended this wedding, and at the time Wallis was still quite a young man. The publicity about the talking picture that Mr. Wallis gave on the Vitagraph led to the production of The Jazz Singer in 1927, generally regarded as the first talking picture. But it also had singing. Wallis referred to Al Jolson as Jolie. Incidentally, it was rumored by my grandfather that I'm related to Al Jolson. Warner quickly needed more studio space and acquired its present-day Burbank location. Wallis was in charge of the Burbank studio known as Warner. Darryl Zanuck was in charge of the Warner operation named First National in Los Angeles, which was consistently running seconds to Wallis's operation. By 1928, Wallis was the production manager of Warner. I think it's important to remark here that most people have heard of Darryl Zanuck. They haven't heard necessarily of Hal Wallis, which is very strange and very unfortunate. Now, in 1933, Zanuck had a salary dispute with Jack Warner. When Zanuck left for a job at 20th Studios, later 20th Century Fox, Wallis became executive in charge of production for the next 9 years at Warner. Wallis decided to bring realism to film. He claims his film featured poor people as poor people meagerly clothed in meager settings. In 1933, Brett Wallis was born to Mr. and Mr. Wallis. Now, generally Jewish people don't have the same name as a son born to them. Brent was not Mr. Wallis's real middle name, and his son was named Brent. Once the couple relocated to Van Nuys, now Sherman Oaks, nobody cared to call it Sherman Oaks at the time, Brent attended the Highland School. Wallis was in charge of a massive number of films each year. The studio made about 50 pictures a year back in the 30s. The intense filming schedules between the Burbank studio and the rural San Fernando Valley locations required Wallis to relocate to the San Fernando Valley.
And make the San Fernando Valley my home.
Which is another fact I think most people are not aware of. A lot of people didn't live in Beverly Hills at the time. The San Fernando Valley was clearly the home of many stars, and it's where a lot of movies were being produced. And remember, now we've got Warner Brothers in Burbank, and there certainly are other studios that are going to end up being in that area too. In Star Maker, which is the autobiography that Hal Wallis wrote in 1980, he wrote that for $30,000 he acquired 60 acres of rolling land on Woodman Avenue. Today, well, I've seen the land my whole life, it's quite flat. He embarked on an English manor. By September of 1935, the newspaper remarked he was nearing the completion of 5100 Woodman Avenue, which Wallis described as an English-style, down-home American farm. Today, there's a condominium or apartment there. At one time, there was the Flower Drum Apartments there. Well, the Wallis estate spanned from Woodman to Sunny Slope. That's going from the west to the east. Sunny Slope's the little street where Millikan sits on. I think that is 5105 Sunny Slope, something like that. And Magnolia was the northern boundary, so this included the area the apartments are on Woodman, and of course Buffalo Street wasn't there. I believe that the Wallis estate may have gone south to Addison Street. Wallis wrote that the main house was 150 feet from Magnolia up a private road. There was an electric gate at Magnolia. Writers described the exterior of the home as not remotely reflecting the home of a major Hollywood producer. The movie projector Wallis watched dailies on, presumably those of Casablanca, came up from the floor. Otherwise, this was called the Blue Room, had a low ceiling, and passed for a den. Just so that everyone understands, I had the option of doing this in Eventbrite and charging people for it. I opted not to do that. And I want to let you know that this kind of a show does cost a tremendous amount of money to produce. The pictures you're seeing, some of them I had to acquire. I had to pay an archive to gain some of these pictures. So we're going to actually run a commercial right now. All right. And we'll be back in just a moment on the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show, and some of the commercials you're going to hear are going to be a lot of fun. Maybe not this one.
The Employment Lawyers Group has successfully represented employees in wrongful termination, sexual harassment, employment discrimination, and unpaid wage lawsuits, including class actions. They are only paid when and if money is collected from the employer. Call 877-525-0700 during the week for an experienced job lawyer. 877-525-0700.
And make the San Fernando Valley my home.
We're back on the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show, and as promised, we're going to now talk a lot more about Wallis's English estate, which is why I know a lot of you have come to this particular video. Wallis described the valley air as clean, clear, full of scents of mimosa and honeysuckle. Although the Wallis couple collected period furniture, polished brassware, and English china, listen to this because there's a lot of English references which are going to make even more sense later. On weekends, they went out onto the lot in their Packard and planned their home. Now, I wasn't sure when he made these references in his autobiography if he was talking about before he was building his home or afterwards, because in a close point in that writing, he said that he and Louise went out into the lot to plant orchards of apricot, walnut trees, and a grape arbor close to the home on the Wallis estate, which we now know is on the present-day site of Millikan Junior High School. The Wallis estate featured a pool and a stable for riding horses. Imagine that, riding horses right onto Magnolia Boulevard in Sherman Oaks or up Woodman towards the three-way. Riding was pretty popular back then in the 30s in the San Fernando Valley. It was one of the best places to do it. Riding in the hills was great. Well, the main home was white brick, and if you look at the picture of the home, it actually doesn't look like an English cottage at all. It looks more Spanish to me. A small cottage was built for Louise's mother to live. Interesting fact, when Louise and Hal got married, Louise's mother didn't think he was going to amount to anything. And she was a couple years older than him, if you can believe that. Although Warner was heavily in debt during the 30s due to the rapid expansion and entrance into talking films, and their films were actually kind of complicated because they started making musicals. Neither of the Wallaces were in need of money. Louise had been investing in Los Angeles and Southern California real estate for some time, even though her film career by this time had pretty much ended. Wallis earned a considerable salary from Warner, and he was also making investments. But nonetheless, they envisioned that their little estate there was going to be both an estate and income-producing property. They made a deal for Sunkist to take their oranges from their 60 acres in Encino. They also had bought land there. And on their property here in Van Nuys on Woodman, they independently dried their apricots, and they were sold through a marketing organization. So imagine this, a guy who is kind of running Warner Brothers at the time is trying to resell his apricots. Well, I told you we'd have to go to commercials, and I'm sorry, but we're just going to have to do that. So please bear with me on the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show.
I grow oranges for Sunkist. Go get yourself a Sunkist orange right now. You're going to love it.
The Employment Lawyers Group has successfully represented employees in wrongful termination, sexual harassment, employment discrimination, and unpaid wage lawsuits, including class actions. They are only paid when and if money is collected from the employer. Call 877-525-0700 during the week for an experienced job lawyer. 877-525-0700.
And make the San
This is the Karl
Fernando
Gerber
Valley
Workplace
my
Lawyers
home.
Show, and I'm pleased to say that the Employment Lawyers Group is sponsoring this particular show, and not Remus Helms or the Helms Foundation, so you might hear our commercial. At any rate, Wallis apparently built his home after he failed to find an ideal home. Well, that's something I can identify with. A biographer claimed Wallis knew exactly what he wanted in a home, and anything else lacked meaning to him. So I think you're getting the point by now that this home that Wallis had on the site of present-day Millikan Junior High School was very important to him. And there's some things in here about the English thing that kind of get into the rest of his life. This was the home of a self-made, self-educated man who had a wealth of information on one or two subjects, and one of those subjects was Wallis's keen interest in all things British. Many of the features of the Wallis estate were imported from Britain. They included a fireplace and brickwork, and I found a 1938 permit about getting a better chimney going on that house. The home was a blend of British trappings and American chintz. He produced a number of films in this genre, including Earol Flynn's Technicolor Robin Hood in 1939. Later, from 1964 to 1971, Wallis produced a series of films shot in Britain that piqued Queen Elizabeth II into awarding him the highest honor of the kingdom for a non-British citizen due to his deep knowledge of British culture and history. Imagine that. And this guy thought he was building an English estate in Van Nuys. The Wallaces were uniquely un-Hollywood. Both cared for their parents, although one of the reasons for Wallace's relocation to Van Nuys may have been to get away from having to take care of his mother, who lived with Mina in Beverly Hills in an apartment that Louise owned. Louise may have felt she no longer understood Hollywood, although her husband worked with literally every A-list talent of the era. Wallis may have lacked social grace. These are all theories on, why he was so on Hollywood and why they weren't having big parties at the estate. Although Jerry Lewis shopped and golfed with Wallis, Lewis was adamant that Wallis did not understand comedy. Wallis's claim he and Louise were not pretentious. It may have been true based on my research. He was involved in many things, and Louise was involved in taking care of their son Brent and various charitable activities. Otherwise, the two were heavily involved in significant real estate purchases. And despite being uniquely un Hollywood, soon before February 10th, 1938, $7,100 in property, which would be $120,000 today, was stolen from the Wallis home. The newspaper reported thieves forced their way through the Blue Room, a clear assault on Hollywood, because remember, the Blue Room is where he looked at the dailies. They went upstairs to the study and into a closet where they located a small safe that nonetheless weighed 150 pounds. The thieves left by smashing the gate with a 10-pound sledgehammer they found in a shed on the property. The merchandise stolen included a $300 men's wristwatch, that would have been Hal's, $500 diamond pin, a $1,500 diamond platinum bracelet, a $1,000 pair of diamond clips, a $1,000 diamond ring, and considerable jewelry and clothing of no value. Well, maybe that's what they wore when they picked apricots. The Wallaces and the Pickers must have been gone. Maybe they were at their Malibu home, but I want to emphasize this estate is where the Wallaces lived. It's where he lived during a very important time in his career, and it was not a country house to go to in the San Fernando Valley, and it was a big part of their lives. While the men's watch would be worth $5,300 by today's standards, at least it can be said that Louise was well taken care of, with diamonds worth $13,000 to over $26,000, but perhaps modest by today's standards. Reporting the value of stolen property, incidentally, and itemizing it, this was very common during this era. The newspapers would usually report the address of the theft and all this itemization. Robberies were actually quite commonly reported in the San Fernando Valley around this time. I looked through 20 years of newspapers just to do this. Well, a little more than 20 years, probably 30. But keep in mind, I read old newspapers every day of my life getting historic information. In terms of where all these robberies were, a tremendous number of them were at the 8,000 blocks going north in the San Fernando Valley. And I think you know that's going to be like north of Roscoe, and so even back then, I guess those were not great neighborhoods. Luckily, there were not reports of second or third hits on the residents after publicizing the value of the contents. Maybe the would-be thieves figured whatever was in these homes was already stolen. One of Wallace's investments was 20 acres of open land on the northeast corner of Sepulveda and Ventura Boulevard. Now there's Union Bank there, you probably know, and there's also World Market, but I remember before it was World Market, it was something else. The Wallaces owned the land on which Thrifty sat, and they got income from renting to that corporation, Rite Aid, Thrifty, for years and years and years, and he thought that was one of the best investments he ever made. But imagine buying all that land on that corner. And you know what? The land went back, because another part of the land that is in back of the World Market now, the Thrifty, Rite Aid, whatever you want to call it, in Union Bank, is called Hal Brent Street, and that's named obviously after Hal, which is his assumed name, and Brent, which is his assumed name, but he says it was named after his son. And I suspect, I spent a lot of time on county assessor sites, different websites, and I think the land went from Sepulveda and Ventura to Burnett Street, west to east, and I think going north it was going to be to Moore Park. So, you know, it was a lot of land. They also had the 60 acres in Encino, a lot of land along Magnolia Boulevard and Woodman area, between Woodman and Hazeltine. And in researching this article, I did communicate with a lot of people that lived on the street to the south of Magnolia between Woburn and Hazeltine. Some of them reported that they lived in a small tract, 12 or 13 homes that were basically built on his land. And I found records, I think it was 13836 Magnolia, that Louise owned that and rented that, and those were estates back then. So this was not a couple that wasted their money. And one can only imagine how Wallis's finances increased over the years due to his investments and continued production. So we got to take another break. Sorry about all these commercials. This is the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show.
Every day's a savings day at Thrifty Drug and Discount Store. A dollar buys you more at Thrifty.
Royal Persian henna hair products bring exotic beauty and luster to your hair with a neutral henna formula that won't change hair color. Buy Royal Persian henna shampoo and conditioner, just $2.66 each, and hairspray, just $2.09 through Tuesday.
At Thrifty.
That commercial is post-dating the period we're talking about, obviously, and it was maybe not even called Thrifty Cut Rate Drugs then.
The Employment Lawyers Group has successfully represented employees in wrongful termination, sexual harassment, employment discrimination, and unpaid wage lawsuits, including class actions. They are only paid when and if money is collected from the employer. Call 877-525-0700 during the week for an experienced job lawyer. 877-525-0700.
You must remember this. A kiss is still a kiss.
Could you play that again? Oh yes, this is the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show, and we're talking about Hal Wallis, and we're still in that period, 35 to 55, when he had the affiliation with his English estate. And so he's working hard, and there's going to be a film, and there's an actor named George Raft who kept declining, and well, while living on his Van Nuys estate, Wallis produced High Sierra, which was turned down by Raft, and The Maltese Falcon, and of course Casablanca, which you've been hearing the theme music from. Lillian and Hellman allegedly convinced Dashiell Hammett to script The Maltese Falcon. The property that I live on, well, the rumor is the mystery writer who used to live on my property, he was the ghostwriter for Dashiell Hammett, and I wonder who really wrote that script for The Maltese Falcon. Was it Dwight Babcock or was it Dashiell Hammett? What Wallis did tell us about that is that, well, it was a miracle to get Dashiell Hammett to agree to write this, and it came in slowly, but it came in during The Maltese Falcon. But The Maltese Falcon didn't win an Academy Award. Another movie did. Yes, Casablanca won at the 1944 Academy Awards, and it didn't come out in 1944, but that's when it happened. And when it was announced that it had won for Best Picture, the man who had spent all this time producing the movie, well, he stood up, but unfortunately, Jack Warner rushed up to the stage with a broad, flashing smile and a look of great self-satisfaction. Wallis later recalled, "I couldn't believe it was happening. Casablanca had been my creation. Jack had absolutely nothing to do with it." As the audience gasped, I tried to get out of the row of seats and into the aisle, but the entire Warner family sat blocking me. I had no alternative but to sit down again, humiliated and furious. Almost 40 years later, he writes in 1980, I still haven't recovered from the shock. A Hollywood columnist wrote a series of articles about how, well, that Academy Award really should have gone to Hal Wallis, and something unthinkable happened. the Academy actually issued another award and gave it to Wallis. This was not the only Academy Award that Wallis got for Best Picture. And I think that his movies involve something like 32 Academy Award wins in different categories, 112 nominations, but we'll get to that in a minute. I'm not aware of any other producer that had that much. Remember, this is not a guy making grindhouse films or TV movies. He's the guy who did 3 major Humphrey Bogart movies, which are regarded clearly as classics, and you're going to hear about a lot of other people he worked with. Anyone and everyone he worked with for a very long period of time. At any rate, angered over the Academy event and other overbearing issues of Warner, in 1944, Wallis left. He turned down offers from all the major studios and accepted an offer from Paramount. He decided to go, I think, to the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and he actually met up with Joseph Hazen there, and he had been, I think, the vice president of Warner, and he left, and the two of them ended up having what was an independent production company. This was not a small-time independent production company producing art house films. It ended up being financed immediately in 1944 with a $2.5 million line of credit from the First Bank of Boston, who had never before financed an independent production company. So for you film buffs, Wallis is essentially the first real publicist in Hollywood. He says at that time the press was nice and not grilling, and they just liked to talk. And then he's got this independent production company, and they're big time people that had independent production companies afterward. That's really how Woody Allen has operated, and his movies have involved all kinds of A-list people and been big deals. But you know, that was a little bit after Hal Wallis in 1944, in the middle of World War II. That's the music from The Rose Tattoo. And that was an adapted play. In 1955, Wallis's film, The Rose Tattoo, was nominated but did not win. In 1964, another winless nomination was Beckett. In 1969, another winless award, Annie of 1,000 Days, which competed with Wallis's film True Grit, for which John Wayne did win for Best Actor. Wallis came in 4th place numerous years in the Golden Laurel Award for Best Producer. In 1975, he won the Cecil D. DeMille Award at the Golden Globes. In 1982, he won the American Movie Award for Special Marquee. During his life, he was associated with 32 Academy Award wins and 121 nominations. Go find me a director or producer associated with that many awards. And no one ever mentioned the fact, when I went to Millikan Junior High School, the school was on his former home. Other remarkable Wallis films during his stay in Van Nuys included film noir classics and starring Burt Lancaster. This one, I Walk Alone, and Sorry Wrong Number, great films. As an independent producer, he hired screenwriters. Keep in mind the screenwriters he hired. One was Anne Rand. The other was Lillian Hellman. These are not hack screenwriters. These are some pretty serious women. Yeah, he had women screenwriters in 1940s, and they were not your average people. I think we all know what novels and things the two of those women are associated with. Besides Lillian Hellman being a confidant of Dashiell Hammett, she certainly had her own career. Now, during this time, he also produced Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin films. He found Lewis very demanding. There was a story about how Jerry Lewis didn't think any of the cars in Europe the studio was giving him were good enough to be chauffeured around in and all kinds of things. But the two of them were friendly, and they went shopping and played golf. But But Jerry Lewis did not think that Herb Wallace had a sense of humor. And I can see that because in doing this month-and-a-half long research on him every day of my life, I think the guy was a businessman. I think he was a very good one, and he was very busy with what he was doing, and he wasn't there to make jokes and get drunk. In his autobiography, Star Maker, Wallace claims that he was eating breakfast during the late 1940s when he read a letter from the Board of Education stating they were requisitioning 22 of his acres for a school. The position of the school would require Wallace's home be torn down. This is the home the self-made man built, raised his family on, and it's in this English style which is formative of the rest of his life. Wallace, in his autobiography, claims he fought the action with lawyers in the studio. I could not find a case where he had fought the action. And this is speculation on my part, which I should not do, and I shouldn't be speculating about Dwight Babcock writing The Maltese Falcon, but it's fun, and you got to do this as a historian that studied these people. And Dwight Babcock did an Elvis movie, but it wasn't one that Wallace did, so I don't know. But at any rate, Wallace, when he was sitting in his house in the late 40s, I don't know if that date was right because I can't find evidence that they were planning to do the school that early there. But what I do think is the letter also may have been related to a potential site for Los Angeles Valley College, very important institution. Because on October 20th, 1949, there was a $7 million plan to construct the junior college bounded by Chandler to the north, Woodman to the west, and 1,250 feet from the eastern corner of Fulton and Magnolia to the south, which is the neighborhood that I grew up in. And that's across the street from the Wallace estate. Well, at any rate, the residents protested, and a high water table may have been the reason why the plans to have Valley College in that tract of homes between Woodman and Fulton, Magnolia and Chandler may have been the reason why Valley College did not actually go there. But what's interesting is this plan was announced October 20th, 1949. Well, on December 5th, 1949, the City Commission approved the Coronet Construction's 226-tract lot north of Magnolia and east of Woodman, where I was raised. Permits were pulled in March and July of 1950, and most of those houses were done by March of 1951. So there was a lot of competing notions about taking the land in the area of the Wallace estate for schools between Valley College, the junior high school, and other such things. Now, with the large Coronet tract facing the Wallace estate to the north, 226 tract homes, the filled-in neighborhood to the east of Sunny Slope, and the tract to the south of the Wallace home, the Wallaces may have realized that they were no longer living in idyllic seclusion. There was also Notre Dame High School, which popped up, I think, 1947, but some of it was done in 1951, and that also was really where Wallace was. I mean, who wants to live between that and all these tract homes? So I don't know. I think they had some interest in getting out of the area, and the streets must have become a bit more busy on Woodman and Magnolia than when they were purchasing the land in the early 30s. In 1935, the Wallace estate extended to the corner of Woodman and Magnolia. Okay, so you got that corner's him. The Buck Jones Ranch, he was a silent cowboy star that later gets turned into the Marquis School. I remember seeing that at Chandler Elementary School in 1977 from the playground. It was a beautiful old Spanish house. But at any rate, the Buck Jones Ranch was in the southeast corner of Hazeltine and Magnolia, and his barn is a house now. If you go take a walk in that area, you can find it. But anyways, diagonal to the Buck Jones Ranch on Hazeltine and Magnolia, the northwest corner where the Church of the Chimes property is, there was an estate there, and the pool on the Church of the Chimes property is a remnant of that estate, by the way. That's why that's there. I remember that when I was in Cub Scouts and wondering, why is there a pool here and why am I in this building with an old kitchen? It just didn't match up. And as a young history student at 9 years old, these are the kind of things that make you become a historian. You can't figure out why you're looking at a kitchen that's older than the church and why there's a residential looking pool, and it just doesn't make sense. And you spend your whole life trying to solve these mysteries. And this whole thing with Wallis is one mystery I knew nothing about. During his stay in the Valley, Wallis was also on the commission for the Van Nuys Sherman Oaks War Memorial Park, which we know as VNSO now. It spans from Hazeltine to Van Nuys Boulevard, Magnolia to the north, across from Horace Heights. So keep in mind, this is not a guy who was vacationing in San Fernando Valley. This was his home. Other Valley civic involvement included on September 11th, 1951, the beautiful Hal Wallis estate was the site of Temple Beth Hillel's 5th membership tea. It is purported that my grandmother was the secretary to the first rabbi at that temple. Louise, I don't think, converted. She was not Jewish, but she did lend her home for various temple events. She was a wonderful woman. She apparently was also just really trying to take care of people, and if there are poor people, she was buying things for them. She was a very generous, special woman. In March 24th, 1955, in the paper, it was reported that Wallis had tried to rezone his property as R1. That's single-family zoning. You know, first in 1953, he tried to rezone the property for commercial purposes. Walking distance up the Sunny Slope on Riverside Drive at the time, in 1952, the Vons and Quigley shopping center was completed. So I can understand why Wallis was considering that move, especially with the school board wanting his home. He referred to it as the school board. It wasn't called LAUSD then. I think he wanted out. And the other thing is, during this period of time, the controversy in the area was rezoning agricultural property to R1 lots. I think the controversy today is accessory dwelling units, it's big apartments, mansionizations, but then the controversy was that agricultural lots were being rezoned to single-family homes. And this was the period the San Fernando Valley was becoming the largest suburb in history. September 1st, 1955, it was reported the former Wallis property was being considered by the Board of Education for a new junior high school. Wallis claimed the drawn-out process of moving his home to the school authorities put a toll on Louise's health. Architectural Digest claims Wallis owned the home until 1958, but I don't think that's accurate. The couple moved to 515 South Mapleton in Beverly Hills. The home is a Walter Neff, featured in Architectural Digest, just like the Wallis estate in Van Nuys was. But when Wallis got there, he modified it to give it a distinctively English facade, and he owned it until he died. Residents in the Coronet Tract, that's the neighborhood I grew up in between Fulton and Magnolia. I'm sorry, Fulton, Woodman, Magnolia, and Chandler. Well, they report that the home remained for some time until what I found is 18.996 acres of the Wallis estate became Millikan Junior High School. Residents in the housing tract east of Millikan report that the Wallis estate was fenced with barbed wire. Kids broke through, and a neighborhood boy stabbed the neighborhood girl with the wire, presumably by accident, and this is somewhat disputed by other neighbors who were corresponding about this once I started the discussion. Other neighborhood people who became Millikan Junior High School students claim there was a fire at the Wallis home, but during this time before the junior high school was put up, they got into the Wallis home nonetheless. Imagine that beautiful home, and it wasn't even very old. Us Millikan turtles were taught Millikan Junior High School. Now it's a Millikan Middle School. It opened in 1959. Building records indicate at least some of the school was still being built in 1960. They're coming to take me away. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Millikan was the cream of the crop junior high school in the eastern San Fernando Valley. Students would use other students' addresses to attend the school. All right, let's take a break because we're still talking about Millikan, but I think we need to take a quick break from the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show.
The Employment Lawyers Group has successfully represented employees in wrongful termination, sexual harassment, employment discrimination, and unpaid wage lawsuits, including class actions. They are only paid when and if money is collected from the employer. Call 877-525-0700 during the week for an experienced job lawyer. 877-525-0700.
This is the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show, and in the early 80s, Millikan Junior High became dominated by no other than a computer software piracy ring. One faction was referred to as Chaos, named after the evil Axis depicted in Get Smart. Once Captain Lemur Eyes got into the pre-internet modem community, and Lemur Jr. created a fake Ware. A Ware is a game for those of you non-modem studs. The brothers used that Ware to trade with Chaos, and the brothers emerged as a monopolistic team of modem studs. Huh?
Game over.
That sounds like Apple Panic. Huh. Well, at any rate, during this time in the early 80s at Millikan, there were briefcases, floppy disks that were sold to wannabe modem studs who brought their floppy disk carrying cases to campus, and there was physical and electronic violence that was quite commonplace. And during the era of the modem stud, in which I happened to go to Millikan Junior High School, and so I won't say what my relationship was to the Lemur brothers, you'll just have to read Modem Stud, but there was no mention ever that Hal Wallis had anything to do with the school. There was just no mention of him, but Richard Zanuck's son was involved. He recruited Lemur Jr. to crack, that is, pirate, an uncrackable Ware that may have come early due to his father's business. He is the son of Daryl. The Ware was then widely distributed by Captain Lemur Eyes. I have direct and personal knowledge of this, and it caused a rift with the rival modem gang from the Buckley School called the Waste It, which the Lemur brothers briefly infiltrated. Long after the Lemur brothers' reign, Millikan became a performing arts school, but again, there was no mention of Hal Wallis. In 1954, as I mentioned earlier, Hal Wallis was working with Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. But, well, by 1960...
And blue Hawaii.
Well, if working with Dean Martin wasn't enough, he had to start working with Elvis. He signed a contract, I think it was in 1961 that he started working with Elvis officially. And we hear a lot about those Elvis movies now, don't we? He did a lot of movies with Elvis, and into the stint, he invited Elvis to dinner, and Elvis shunned him. I guess Elvis always wanted a lot of excitement, you know. He was bored. He was going to go to sleep when the Beatles came over to his house, and we're just watching TV. So I guess a guy who didn't know comedy could not entertain Elvis. In 1962, when producing an Elvis movie in Hawaii, he received the call that his beloved Louise died of a heart attack. In 1963, Wallis produced Wives and Lovers. Before boarding a plane in 1964, Wallis ran into Martha Hyer, a beautiful blonde. She was an actress 26 years younger than Wallis, 40 at the time. In 1960, she was nominated for an Academy Award, and her spectacular home was also featured in Architectural Digest. There's a picture of her looking into the city, and it looks like that very famous picture that we see of Los Angeles by Sherman. At any rate, the two struck up a conversation on the airplane, had a date in New York, and were married in 1966. Martha converted to Judaism after they married, and they remained married until Wallace's death. Martha made appearances on several TV shows during their marriage, including Bewitched, Beverly Hillbillies, and Family Affair. In 1967, Wallace produced Barefoot in the Park. Now, there's a lot about Wallace and modern art if you look into it. He became involved in the Los Angeles Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think that's MoCA. And after his death, there was litigation. No, maybe that's not. After his death, there was litigation over his art collection, and there's a book from 1970 on his collection at the museum. I thought he was involved at the museum on Wilshire Boulevard. At any rate, Brent Wallace, the son, earned a PhD in psychology. He lived in Santa Barbara. Some speculate his father couldn't grasp why he didn't want to go in the show business. Wallace's own account of his son tends to indicate that his son Brett was quite intelligent and preferred learned accomplishments. Some claim Wallace produced 500 films, others claim slightly less than 400. These were not television specials or grindhouse films. They were top films of the days with top actors, composers, sets, and talent. There was no end to the A-list talent that Wallace worked with throughout his career. Near the end of his career, he worked with Jane Fonda, Robert Redford, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton. Jerry Lewis claimed he made Wallace attend the show. Shirley MacLaine danced in and urged Wallace to sign her before someone else did. Wallace was also instrumental in starting the career of Kirk Douglas, probably Clark Gable, and certainly he made Humphrey Bogart's career, who is regarded as one of the best actors of all time. Others he worked with were James Cagney, Marion Davis. He did go to the Hearst Castle. He also had run-ins with Hughes. He thought Hughes was sort of a joke, glad to get away from him. He worked with Ronnie Reagan, who he considered his friend. I can picture the two of them golfing in the 80s in Rancho Mirage, where Mr. Wallace also lived and his sister lived. He was with Burgess Meredith, Katharine Hepburn, who was a Wallace fan, nothing but good things to say about him, William Powell, Betty Davis, Charlton Heston, Burt Lancaster, Joan Fontaine, Audrey Hepburn, Walter Matthau, Anthony Quinn, Peter O'Toole, and Elizabeth Scott. There's a lot of speculation on Mina and whether she was gay, and Elizabeth Scott is arguably one of the most beautiful women ever in film, but I guess she was gay, and so there's that whole thing in this also, which is kind of interesting. In 1970, Wallace moved on to Universal, and in 1973, Queen Elizabeth II bestowed the Commander of the British Empire the CBE Award on Wallace, an American citizen. A year earlier, she told him the British were learning about English history through Wallace's films. She attended the opening of one of his films. A biographer compared Anne of 1,000 Days and Mary, Queen of Scots, to a graduate seminar on Tudor history. And this is the man who had the house in Sherman Oaks on the property of Millikan that was supposed to look English, and this was his lifelong fascination. Wallace died of complications from diabetes in Rancho Mirage right before his 88th birthday. The Hal B. Wallis Building at Eisenhower Hospital in Rancho Mirage contains the Heart Research Facility. Wallace was there when Hollywood started. Honestly, truthfully, he was there. He produced silent to sound, to early musical, to Technicolor, to comedians and musicians turned film star, to films converted from Broadway play to British films the Queen of England admired through their authenticity. He was the most prolific producer ever. Sorry, Remus Helms. Because he never owned a studio and did not emanate a larger-than-life personality, his name perhaps has not withstood the test of time. Avoiding large-scale fights, scandals, consecutive marriages, never-ending projects, avoidance of hard work, and financial problems, none of those were Wallis. He kept going when others had long forgotten and been robbed of their rights and riches. Film production is a business, and Wallis was a businessman whose investments in talent and real estate were generally sound. That's Mr. Wallis. And that's the story that no one seems to know. No one knew that he was in Van Nuys, which became Sherman Oaks. Nobody who was ever a Millikan Junior High School alumni was told about that. And if it's a performing arts school now, why wouldn't they want to be named the Hal Wallis School of Performing Arts? The man who was picking Shirley MacLaine out of a musical and turning her into the actress who later goes on to be in Sweet Charity. The man who's getting Humphrey Bogart in Academy Award-winning movies. The man who finds Elizabeth Scott and all these other women he worked with. Hepburn, both of them. Why? Why would the school not want to take on the name of this man, who was second-generation immigrant, like many of the students who've attended Millikan Junior High School since it opened? Why would the city forget this man? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And if nothing else, I was bothered by the fact I was always told the Millikan Junior High School sat on the property of the poultry farm. And in the Facebook group for Millikan Junior High School alumni, which has some great posts in it, somebody posted an aerial map, and I said, that can't be. It's supposed to be a chicken ranch. And someone else said, no, that's where Hal Wallis lived. He's the one who produced Elvis Movies. I started looking into it, and yeah, he produced Elvis Movies, but there's so many other movies this man produced. A-list, all over the place. And no one ever thought to say this is where his home was. I don't know if, it was such a bitter dispute, and he'd lost his home, and his wife feels it's ruining her health, and his son is being uprooted, that he doesn't want anything to do with it. I don't think anyone consulted. They just named the school after eugenics. Man, a famous physicist who was instrumental in Caltech, but he certainly didn't think very much of Jewish people, and that's kind of an insult to Hal Wallis to have this school named after some guy that's a Nazi. Well, at any rate, this is what I've been doing the last month and a half, and this is why you have not heard the Karl Gerber Workplace Lure Show on the radio since December 19th. Sometimes I get involved in historic projects that take my time. This will not be the only presentation on this subject, I guarantee you. And there's more research to come. This is ongoing. It's really one of those things in history that's very significant. And it's very significant about the Valley, too, because you have to understand, when Wallis came here, there was a lot of movie production going on. There were all kinds of movie ranches all over the Valley. RKO had theirs in Encino. There was filming in a lot of places. And it was rural. And this is where these movie stars went and lived. Clark Gable was in Encino for years. Everyone was in the Valley. They wanted ranches. Any old cowboy star like Buck Jones had to go to the Valley. They all had to, because that's what you did. Toluca Lake, the San Fernando Valley, large tracts of land, you build your ranch. And those were 20 acres or 60 acres. Wallis had 60. That was a lot of land. But then we get them chopped up into small lots, 5,000, 6,000 square feet. Horace Heights, he started there in the 40s, next to the Church of the Chimes. He wanted to have a place for his bandmates. And, they were willing to maybe chop some lots in the R40 lots, 40,000 square feet, minimum lots. R30, 30,000 square feet. You get those along Magnolia. Weddington by Chandler Elementary School, tons of homes like that. But the real controversy was R1 lots, the tract homes. And then, after Wallis got out of that area, there were gigantic apartments being built along Woodman. So the area was really changing during this period of time, and it's odd that so many of these movie stars had these grand, gigantic estates, and they didn't last very long, because in a 20-year period of time, this went from being rural agriculture to being just a gigantic suburb with a lot of traffic and schools everywhere. And Buck Jones, I want to say he died in the fire, his wife did, and so I don't think he actually lived in that house that long. And then it became the Marquis School. For years, it was a school. It was so big, it was a school. That's what these properties were. They were just gigantic properties. And if you go on the Millikan Junior High School property, you're going to find some trees on there that I am certain are from the Hal Wallis estate. And I'm going to be doing some research on that. One of the things we do as historians are ways of measuring the ages of trees and comparing them in pictures. The tree in back of his home that you saw, I think that tree is still at Millikan, and I think that it's in the bus area, but we'll come back for more of that. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation of the Karl Gerber Workplace Lawyer Show. See you next time.
And make the San Fernando Valley my home.
Every day's a savings day at Thrifty Drug and Discount Store. Your dollar buys you more at Thrifty.
Royal Persian henna hair products bring exotic beauty and luster to your hair with a neutral henna formula that won't change hair color. Buy Royal Persian henna shampoo and conditioner, just $2.66 each, and hairspray, just $2.09 through Tuesday.
The Employment Lawyers Group has successfully represented employees in wrongful termination, sexual harassment, employment discrimination, and unpaid wage lawsuits, including class actions. They are only paid when and if money is collected from the employer. Call 877-525-0700 during the week for an experienced job lawyer. 877-525-0700.